I'm Richard Serrett. Join me on Strange Planet for in-depth conversations with the world's top paranormal investigators, alien abductees, Bigfoot trackers, monster hunters, time travelers, alternative archaeologists, remote viewers, and more.
As I was on the way to Area 51, I was stopping on the side of the road and just taking measurements. And I found this one spot where time slowed down by a fraction of a second. It's not supposed to do that.
From the two big categories, animal mutilations and human abductions, you have to conclude that genetic material is being harvested.
Well, I reached for a rifle, and I turned and looked, and it was already moving away, and it was descending the bluff. There's no way any human could have went down it. It was probably a 75-degree angle straight down, almost.
On Richard Serrett's Strange Planet, we're redefining reality. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Do not go any further. Turn around. Go home.
Hey, Frankie, who was that guy who whacked that Archduke of Australia? You know, the guy who started the First World War. You mean Archduke Franz Ferdinando? I don't know, Paulie. Was it Oswald? Nah, I think his name was Giuseppe Principelli or something like that. Hey, boss, what do you think?
Now listen, you idiots. It was not the Archduke of Australia who got whacked. It was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. And it was no Giuseppe Principelli. It was Gravillo Princip. What, did you guys have some bad gabagool or something? You guys both wouldn't be such boombots if you started listening to that podcast, Bro History. It's one of the best history and geopolitical-related podcasts in the world. And they talk about the origins of World War I and other major historical events. And they also cover modern conflicts, adding historical context to complicated geopolitical issues. And it's no excuse not to listen, because you can easily find Bro History on every podcast platform, like Apple and Spotify. Now go listen to Bro History. And why's my envelope light?
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. This is Danny Abdeljabbar. Henry is away, and not to spill the beans, but he has had a child. I'll let him come on the show and talk about it another juncture, but he might be away for a little while, and we decided to have an episode anyway. So today I've got a friend of the show, Joseph Solis Mullen, author, journalist, research fellow, political scientist, and generally smart dude. What's up, Joe? How's it going?
Hey, Danny. It's real warm. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm sweating bullets. It's 88 here in Michigan.
Oh, woof. That's hotter than Puerto Rico right now.
Yeah, this is outrageous. So I'm sweating. That's all I'm doing.
And you've probably got your fans and ACs off right now to keep it nice and quiet in the room that you're in, right?
Oh, yeah.
Just like me.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully you don't sweat for too long. Today's episode, like I said, Henry's out, decided to bring you on to talk about some stuff that we love talking about. But I wasn't thinking that this is going to be a super long episode, but generally we end up talking for a long time anyway. So let's see where it goes, right?
All right.
But today we're going to be talking about aliens because Henry's not here to tell me otherwise. So you're going to have to deal with that, Henry. I just wanted to give you a little interesting footnote. I don't know if you heard, but NASA just today had a live stream. Today's May 31st, by the way. Had a live stream about the UAP task force, right? So that's the Unmanned Aerial Phenomenon Task Force. And basically, they were talking about all of their findings. And I feel like I always get let down with these things, but I always get really, really pumped when they're about to happen. And during this live stream, there was a bunch of speakers that talked about a variety of concerns and findings related to UAPs. And this one guy, Dan Evans from NASA's Science Mission Directorate, he spoke about things like safety concerns, about the potential of aliens, right? But generally speaking, just risks to air safety, right? Like these unmanned aerial phenomenon could potentially crash into a plane or disrupt air traffic, which was the boring part about it. And of course, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Now, the download that I got out of this, Joe, is that basically, all of the data that we have that's good that NASA's using in this is publicly available, but they still haven't shared it, right? It's not like classified documentation. They haven't really shared anything. They shared one video and picture from a regular plane and said, "Oh, this is nothing. You know, this is the only thing that we can share with you today." But what's interesting is that chair, the chair of NASA, the NASA team, David Spergel, he was saying that, you know, basically the reason why a lot of this information is limited, the classified information, is not necessarily because of the subject matter of what they're taking pictures of, but because of the sensors that they're using to take the pictures with. And he said specifically, it's like, hey, you know, the U.S. Navy can take a picture of the Statue of Liberty from an F-16 or an F-35 or something like that, and that picture is now classified, not because the Statue of Liberty is classified, but because the camera that they used to take it with is. And I'm thinking to myself, well, just then don't tell us what you took the picture with. Just show me the picture. But yeah, what do you think, man? Where's your headspace on for aliens?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, certainly way outside my domain of expertise. You know, I mean, from what I understand, interstellar space travel would require technologies that are beyond anything we have at this point. But also that, you know, theoretically there are billions of other galaxies out there, and that mathematically speaking, it's almost certain that at least one of them is capable of producing an evolved life form of some sentience. Mm-hmm. So I'm open-minded. I certainly hope that if any do show up, that they are more peaceable than our own species. But that's pretty much it. I don't know. I mean, I guess I always figured that a lot of the stuff that was spotted, especially given where it was spotted, being so near, you know, military installations and stuff, that it was either our own government's experimental prototypes, or maybe, you know, some other foreign government maybe trying to spy using some sort of, you know, really advanced equipment,
novel technology, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that, you know, the government was maybe aware of this but didn't want to freak Americans out, that stuff was going on. You know, maybe they're doing it too. So I don't know. I don't take any strong position. I've seen no evidence to persuade me one way or the other. So,
well, I guess it's good to kind of keep a middle of the road opinion on this one, because, you know, it's really easy to point at examples of things that can't be explained, and even easier to point at examples of things that can be explained. There's this one bit from this live stream that I found really hilarious, and it was these researchers at were studying cosmic background radiation or some shit like that, and they started seeing these unusual radio bursts come up in their data, and they just could not explain it. And it was like these patterns that are not, I guess, I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to butcher this. It was an unusual radio burst pattern, and they were, you know, starting to get kind of excited and thinking, maybe we finally got ET. You know, they're contacting us, right? Turns out that when they were reviewing the data, they noticed that the pattern of when they would see this particular radio bursts happened around noon every day, right? Like every business day, Monday through Friday, while they were working. It was like almost like clockwork. Around noon, they're starting to get these patterns. So it's like, what's going on here? Turns out they were picking up the microwave in their lunchroom. It was microwave instead of radio bursts, which is, I don't know, man.
That's great.
So I don't know. Apparently, according to one of the guys over there, you know, there are over 800 cases of UAP sightings this year, and, you know, only 2 to 5% of them are potentially truly anomalous. The rest of them can be explained, but I'm just like, all right, show me the 2 to 5% then, you know, like,
yeah, let me see the
goods.
Yeah, I would love to have that information be open so that the actual scientific community could look at it. Mm-hmm. But we'll just have to wait and see, I suppose.
Yeah, and that was part of the warning that they were giving. They're trying to destigmatize this. First of all, so they can get high quality data from trained professionals. Like, you know, there's still this stigma in the military about, like, saying, hey, I saw something weird, and then reporting that. There's still a bit of a stigma there. And also there's a stigma for the scientists, that legitimately want to research this, as a legitimate scientific research initiative. And a lot of people look down on them. They're like, "Oh, you're studying UAPs? What are you, crackpot? What is this, phrenology? What is this pseudo nonsense, right?" So yeah, I agree with you. Make it open so that I could talk about it on Bro History more.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, thank you for suffering through that. I'm just kidding. We're not talking about aliens for an entire hour and a half today. We're actually here to talk about something that you're actually good at, and that's China. So you recently put out a pretty interesting article, which is why I hit you up. And you wrote A Few Thousand Years of Chinese Foreign Policy in a Nutshell. And I didn't quite get the word count on this, but it was a shorter one, so it's an easy read. I'll make sure to drop this in the description or something like that. But when we were chatting about it over text message, you were telling me even this was I had so much more to talk about. So maybe you can give us a brief introduction on the article, what prompted you to write it, and then I've got plenty of questions to ask you.
Great. Well, I'll try and keep it succinct then, so I can kick it back to you for your questions. I obviously it's impossible to talk about anything like the foreign policy of a state, especially a state of such lengthy duration as China, in a single article, and especially because of sort of the editorial strictures that I'm under, which is the Institute likes things to be between 800 and 1,000 words. Mm-hmm. So I mean that's very tight. That's mm-hmm. very, very close. And I really had to cut and chop because originally it was quite a bit longer. I just tried to. And so I wound up having to lose some things that I actually thought were kind of important, but that were just too nuanced. My wife said listening to me talk is horrible because it's just parenthetical aside after parenthetical aside with qualification with qualification. She said, just make your initial statement and then, say whatever you need to. Mm-hmm. I think the article is fine. It's worth reading. I think it is generally true. That China has, undergone periods of, unity, fragmentation, expansion, contraction. That's all sort of just truisms. Generally speaking, their reach was cultural, that it was, a civilizational sphere that originated, with the Han Chinese, the Yellow River Valley, thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I had to axe, because there was no way that I could keep it in there and even be close to making my word count, which I wound up being over the word count anyway, was all of the military campaigns that occurred during the 18th century, for example. Mm-hmm. This was when the Chinese Empire reached its greatest territorial expanse. So right around the time of I think it was actually in the year of America's founding that it did reach its, I could be wrong. I think I actually am wrong on that, but it's very, very close. It's some major date in U.S. history, and it's kind of intersecting.
Give or take a few years, right?
Yeah, it's really, it's right there in the same decade, give or take a few years. It's that was their greatest territorial extent. It was during the Manchu Qing dynasty. They started, they had 10 military campaigns that, they pushed hard into Central Asia and, really tried to assert state control there. And there have been some really good books written about this and how that was sort of central to sort of the state making process, solidifying the new Manchu dynasty's control. But it was also important because they fought several campaigns against, the Vietnamese kingdom, mm-hmm. Korea, Taiwan, the native Taiwanese during that time. And there's actually a really good book that I linked in the article written by a Korean historian who said that those periods of more aggressive Chinese assertiveness were actually important to the development of an independent national identity. Which mm-hmm. I've found that's actually a common theme. It's actually mm-hmm. a common theme, is that it is in the face of aggressive external powers, that your group sort of coheres more, formulates its own myths, becomes stronger for it. So
are you reading my notes or something like that, man? This is you couldn't have given me the better segue.
Oh, well, good. Go ahead. Go ahead.
That looks like literally one of my questions. I mean, you argued in that article that China's historical foreign policy is driven more by nationalism than the current communist ideology today. And I was wondering if maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how this perspective impacts China's international relations today.
Yeah, so that was one of the really interesting things, because I grew up in a Cold War household. My grandfather was World War II in Korea, and then my dad was Vietnam, and they were hardcore Cold Warriors, and the communists, right? Mm-hmm. The communists, like just one monolithic. It was this thing. And one of the things that when you read, the more technical scholarly literature about it, and this was even available at the time. I actually have a really good I've been kind of working part of this into a chapter for the book that I'm working on, and I have some really great source material that I throw footnotes in there, like, hey, anyone who's interested, read this book, this chapter of this book. There was even like a good Rand Corporation study back in the 1960s that said, we think that there may actually be a split here going on. And this was pre-Nixon, pre-Kissinger. This was just the Rand Corporation saying, it looks like the Soviets and the Chinese communists are fighting each other for influence in third world revolutionary movements, And and part of that goes back to Stalin really hedging in the Chinese Civil War. He cut deals with Chiang Kai-shek. He was very stingy with, his support for Mao. When Mao was ultimately successful, Stalin really didn't give him anything, wanted all sorts of rights and privileges over Chinese territory, didn't want to renegotiate or give up any of the territory that had been Chinese and which was seized by the late Russian Empire of the 19th century, and which, theoretically, I was just reading an article today by a Ukrainian journalist who was saying that she had seen some recently published maps in a new Chinese textbook that showed, certain areas around Lake Baikal and stuff as like, hey, this was once Chinese and stuff.
Disputed.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a long frontier there, and certainly there is a lot of tension there.
Where is Lake Baikal specifically? I wanna look it up on the map.
Yeah, it's right there, and it's the big lake in Central Asia there, right in the lower part of Russia, but I believe it's in Siberia, or like just adjoining it to the west.
Yep.
I don't have a map right in front of me, but
yep. So it looks like it's in Russia, it's literally in Russia, in eastern Russia, just above Mongolia. And so you're saying that lake is being shown as like potentially ours.
Yeah, according I haven't seen the text in question, but I don't really have any reason to doubt this journalist's account. She wrote for The Spectator. It's reasonable, but it's don't really know what there is to gain by saying something like that. Again, Mongolia is one of those uncomfortable ones where the CCP will say things about Taiwan. We have to have that back. All the territory, China, sacred. One thing that I always point out to people is, well, Mongolia is still sitting there, right?
Right.
It's not this huge, move to
Giant
reclaim Mongolia. Exactly. And I just think that, that's one of those things where you say, ideology versus just basic state interest and state calculation. Like Taiwan has become part of their nationalist ideology. And really, I think that's just a smokescreen for just basic strategic interest, right? Whereas Mongolia poses no strategic problem for China,
Right.
There's only a few million people there. There's absolutely no chance the United States is going to put a military base there.
It's
It is
landlocked.
totally, it's landlocked. It's completely locked into China's economic sphere. And also pushing on that would, cause friction with Russia, an ally at this point. Whereas Taiwan is, completely the opposite direction, literally and figuratively. So, but just sorry to get back to what you were saying with the idea that, oh, well, the communists running Beijing, the communism, is this great motivating ideology. Actually, if I was just reading Mike Pompeo's State Department press release from the 19th of January, right as they were about to leave office, about the treatment of the Uyghurs, and they specifically several times reference the fact that they're Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, just coming up with all the scariest ists that they can come up with here. And it's like they're state capitalist, man.
Right.
That's the onlyest. Like they're state capitalist. They have been my entire life, and the idea that they were committed to world revolution and stuff because they helped the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese, that's just not true. And they turned around and fought a war against the North Vietnamese shortly thereafter. And they only support North Korea for strategic reasons because they recognize that, left all things being equal, what would have happened was the peninsula would have been unified under the South, and that would have brought U.S. forces right up to their border. So that's so it seems as plain as day, that, and when you, for example, the Beijing Olympics, it was really just a huge display of Chinese nationalism and Chinese tradition and stuff like that. That was stuff that Mao thought needed to be thrown in the literal dustbin of history. That was the stuff that was holding China back, But now that they're, state capitalist and stuff, that is the glue that makes the Chinese nationalism stick. And the CCP is now just another regime, and I think their legitimacy comes from the fact that they were able to, make China rich, certainly a lot richer. But there's really nothing about the state or the way it's organized or the way it conducts its foreign policy that's, quote unquote communist internationalist or anything like that. And I've spent way too much of my time reading and looking into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of people place way too much emphasis on the labels that we identify ourselves as, and not necessarily like the actuality, like the on the ground reality of what's going on. I mean, they certainly would say, yes, we are a communist, government. That's what we are. Yeah, sure, on paper, like you wrote it down, you're a communist, but you're acting as though, to your point, a state capitalist. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, the bits in your article where, and you kind of brought it up a little bit, but how these Western observers, people on our side, are kind of slow to recognize that those ideological differences and the significance of communist states fighting each other, with this quote particularism, not universalism, being communism's defining feature, as was quoted in your article here. How has this impacted like the West's perception and policies towards China?
Well, certainly it impeded the United States having a more constructive relationship with China right away. This was in part because of the tremendous purges that occurred within the U.S. Foreign policy establishment following World War II, following the loss of, quote unquote, loss of China, following the Red Scare. The establishment came to be dominated by hawks who had basically tunnel vision about it, and there's all sorts of different institutional factors. If people haven't read Mike Swanson's The War State, which is actually a really great account of just kind of the building of the national security apparatus, the foreign policy, the military-industrial complex, like those things, you can kind of really get the cart driving the horse there. So it's complicated, right? Like I'm not going to say there was one specific reason that policy toward China was just very, had the blinders on, saw them as basically just a satellite of, the Soviet Union, well into the 1960s, even when there was plenty of evidence by the late 1950s, to the point where the Rand Corporation, which is
Right,
basically the
as you said.
CIA's think tank, is saying, "Hello, I think we're missing something here." But even then, I mean, it wasn't as though China was under Mao super anxious to get on the Americans' good side. Like they viewed it as well as balancing against the Soviets, because by that point, there were Sino-Soviet border clashes. Like they were on the cusp of military conflict. In fact, the Soviets had reached out to Washington, and this is in just common popular history. It's well known at this point. The Soviets under Khrushchev reached out to the U.S. in the early 60s and said, hey, if we were to, nuke Beijing, like, would you guys object to that? And Washington was like, yeah, we would object. We would object to that. And they were like, okay, we were just checking.
Just kidding.
We were just seeing how you'd feel about that.
Like, okay, how about Shanghai then?
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like so Mao was very interested in doing that, but of course the big sticking point there was Taiwan. It takes almost a decade for them to work out the actual agreements that normalize Sino-American relations. Almost immediately thereafter, the collapse of the Soviet Union, relations become complicated again, because the raison d'etre for the mutual beneficial agreement arrangement here was gone, and that was the shared Soviet threat. And I really think that the reason Sino-American relations were so good, so relatively good during my youth and young adult life is essentially because Washington was very committed to a lot of like the sort of development theory thinking that dominates a lot of foreign policy stuff, like the idea that there are certain transformations that follow certain adoptions, like countries become richer, the middle class starts to demand political rights, yada yada yada. There's plenty of good stuff there, and you can find examples where that worked, where that did happen. But that did not happen with China. And of course, there was a very large business lobby that was interested in doing business in China. And so I think a lot of those things have gone away. I think in Washington now there is a pretty much an agreement that the democracy is not coming to China. That the U.S. business interests have realized that they're never going to get to compete in the Chinese market on anything like fair terms. And so I feel like a lot of those different breakers have been removed, and so we're headed towards a period of much more intense confrontation. In the 1950s, Eisenhower threatened to nuke China repeatedly. We fought an actual hot war against the Chinese in Korea. The Chinines were technically volunteers, so we were never technically at war.
They were legionnaires.
They were 100,000 volunteers.
Volunteers.
And we know now that there were Russian fighter pilots fighting American fighter pilots, and like everyone was just pretending that they were North Korean planes and pilots. I mean, so there's plenty of precedent for stuff getting pushed right to the edge. They all had nukes at that point. The Soviets didn't really have the kind of delivery capabilities that we have now. So it's horrifying to think about, but yeah, we could really see some stuff happen there. There is precedent for it. And so I don't know, the idea of a détente. I don't know. The thinking that motivated that was that China was the weaker of the two, and that while there was friction there, they certainly had some things in common, and it was just an attempt to kind of exploit their differences. I don't know, just from a power politics perspective, how Washington could possibly try to pry Russia and China apart. It seems like everything that's been done over the past 5, 6, 7 years has been almost designed to push them closer together. I don't know if that was actually the plan or if that's just what happened. You know, the left hand didn't know what the other left hand or the right hand was doing.
The other left hand, yeah.
You know, so to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, you know, there are a lot of different, you know, the government, the federal government, the military, the security apparatus. It's not all one thing. There's all these different departments, different priorities, different departments doing different things. I don't know if maybe it's just it's hard to imagine them being split apart now. I feel like we may just be in for a period of very intense tension with both. And I could definitely see it being possible that, you know, 10, 15 years from now, if we're all still alive, that, you know, maybe they've soured the relationship themselves. You know, there are a lot of points of contention there that have kind of just been made easy to paper over because of the U.S. being like very aggressive, especially with trying to confront China now. Whereas it's like, man, they naturally they have hundreds of years of bad blood between them, you know, centuries of bad blood, longer than the U.S. has even been around. So it should be easy to pry them apart theoretically, and to make friends, but.
Well, I mean, we're missing out on that, you know, universal fear of communists taking over the world because Russia's no longer a communist nation. You know, they might act like, you know, a fascist state, but they're not communist anymore, right?
And the Biden administration tried to replace it with a rhetorical device that didn't really work, right? Democracy versus authoritarianism.
Oh, yeah. It didn't roll off the tongue quite as well.
And it didn't work very good because it was very obvious right away that, like, wait a minute, who's on the U.S.'s client payroll here? You know, like, it just didn't work. I don't even hear them trying that anymore.
Right. Yeah. Because there isn't an ism that they can ascribe to that unholy unity of Russia and China. You know, as you pointed out back in the day, everyone was thinking, "Hey, communism's taking over." You lived in a Cold Warrior, you know, household. It was all about, you know, fighting the commies. And now that commies aren't a functional thing right now, you know, I mean, Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Russia is now Russia. And China is still technically communist, but, you know, not really, right? Like, not in action, not in principle. So,
yeah, I mean, their Gini coefficient is basically as high as the United States. I mean,
right. Right, exactly. So, like, now that this narrative is kind of shifting, right, because we can't pull the communism card, I wonder what changes can we expect as this narrative shifts. I mean, we kind of discussed a little bit of the oopsie that the West has made and pushing them back together, you know, through the various things that we've done and reactions that we've had, frankly, from things that they've done, right? So it's not just literally our own policies that have pushed them together, but also just our reactions to their policies and their actions. So what changes now? Like, are we going to slap a new ism on this and then just try and unify the world against them, or what happens next?
Well, I think you make an interesting point there about, you know, it's not just the policies that our government has pursued. It's, you know, just as a matter of course, part of it is them pursuing policies and Washington reacting to them. So going back to the 1990s and the third Taiwan Straits crisis, Beijing viewed what was happening there as a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the agreements that led to the normalization of relations. The U.S. response to their actions prompted them to engage in a military buildup, a military revolution of their own, which we're now seeing the fruits of. China also began in the late aughts, early teens, early 20-teens, to really become more assertive in the South China Sea. There were a lot of outstanding territorial disputes there, and there still are. And I mean, I'm not even going to get into them all, but I mean, like Vietnam, you know, Thailand, the Philippines, Japan, you know, all sorts of different little. And the reason that they're arguing over these rocks is because of You know what I'm going to say here. The exclusive economic zone that comes from these things.
Exactly.
So you get to take up a huge chunk of territory. And what they want is the natural gas and oil that is, at the bottom of the South China Sea here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really even about like, oh, yeah, they would just want to build a bunch of military bases on these tiny rocks. Not really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all close
it comes
enough
with the territory, right? Because they they need to defend said territory.
Right. I mean, they'll probably build a few small naval outposts, like on the shoals, the little man-made islands that they've built and stuff. But really, like, all of these are close enough to China's own coast. I mean, these are, a couple hundred miles from mainland China that, their anti-ship missiles that are located on the mainland can easily hit any of those. And also they're in the process of floating, a pretty substantial blue water navy. So, I mean, it'd be like, why doesn't the United States have a bunch of little tiny, naval stations all over the Gulf of Mexico? It's just not necessary.
Right.
It's just not necessary. So, yeah, gosh, that's really like the hot zone. Everyone knows that. Boy, I don't know. Because certainly everyone feels very justified in taking the positions that they do. Everyone points to this agreement, that treaty, this ancient document, this claim, that claim. And it's like, I get it. The resources. Everybody wants them. Theoretically speaking, it shouldn't matter who controls them because they should all be for sale. But again, there's
the control
China.
Of the sale itself
China has very little oil. Like China is hugely dependent on oil and gas imports, and so they're very sensitive to this stuff. If you read any of their like military planning stuff, they're very obsessed with like a Malacca Strait or Hormuz Strait dilemma because they recognize that all that oil could get shut off to them in a heartbeat.
Right. The control of the sale, really, whether it's through external influences or just straight up a country decides they just don't want to do business with them anymore, and we're not going to sell you any oil. That is up there. There's a power there. Now the smarter move, and I do see China doing this, is pursuing energy from alternate sources. One thing I do applaud China in doing is ramping up nuclear production, and not for like weapons and bombs and stuff. They got plenty of that stuff. They don't need any more. It's things like thorium reactors that really excite me that we barely have any of, and that they've built 18 or something like that in the last few years. These are resources. Thorium specifically is an isotope that we can pull pretty much almost the entire planet has reserves of thorium, or that can be synthesized. So, if we're talking about, if I was China, I'd just be pursuing that rather than oil. But I understand that that's a long game, and so it makes sense in the short term, the very immediate sense, to go after these little rocks in the middle of the water that might be 12 miles around some natural gas or oil deposits that they can extract right now. So it makes a ton of sense to me.
No, that does. And to your point about having better alternatives for the long term, you're absolutely right. And I think we also need to pay attention to a sort of ideological element to the South China Sea conflicts, and that is that Xi has really stoked a lot of very ardent Chinese nationalism. And of course, the South China Sea was, historically, it's the South China Sea.
Right, not the South Japan Sea.
Exactly. And it really, over the past, 300 years, really, they have completely lost control of that region. And so, still having the United States right up in their face right there, it is a point of real ideological contention. There are so many people, just like in our own media establishment, in our own, commentariat, who are way more hardline, who are way more hawkish than the people who actually make the decisions. Thank goodness. But there's all sorts of possibilities for, close calls, just the other day we saw, I think it was yesterday actually.
It was yesterday. The fighter jet that was like 1,000 feet from the aircraft
yeah,
carrier.
Which
nuts.
like 1,000 feet is really close.
Right.
Like these planes are moving very fast. They cover 1,000 feet, in a second here.
Right.
I mean, this is real close stuff, and I was just a kid when this happened, but there was the Hainan Island downing of the U.S. spy plane. It was literally the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
A Chinese jet tried to intercept it and buzzed it just a little bit too close. There was a collision. People can read about it.
Mm-hmm.
It was during the early George W. Bush years. I mean, something like that couldn't be diffused today. I'm quite positive. Something like that could not be diffused today.
That's very irresponsible because an aircraft carrier, it's not like, oh, I didn't notice the aircraft carrier. It's a fucking aircraft carrier, right? The thing is absolutely massive. It shows up on every type of sensor and also just your eyes, right? So this was an intentional move, right? Somebody decided like, hey, I'm going to buzz an aircraft carrier within 1,000 feet. And I just think that's a little stupid, in my opinion. I don't understand the play. Yeah. I don't see how they win with that.
Well, again, and part of it too is, like when the quote unquote spy balloon thing was going on, one of the things that
the alien?
I do what?
You mean the alien?
The alien weather balloon. Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me as very short-sighted about the U.S. response was, I thought it would have been interesting for them to have opened the possibility to see if she would have taken the opportunity to do like a George W. Bush, like write a like, we are very, very sorry for doing this.
Right.
And because, what was that done on Xi's orders? I mean, it happened so close to that big meeting when Blinken was going to go over, and it completely blew that meeting up.
Right.
Was that something where, the right hand doesn't know what the further right hand is doing? Like some hawks, who are more hardline than Xi were just like, yeah, just, steer it over there,
Yeah. Well,
just because the Americans will freak out and, and then they won't come and, there'll be no détente. We don't want the relationship cooling off.
Mm-hmm.
We like it going the way it's going.
Mm-hmm.
Because when Nancy Pelosi made her visit to Taiwan,
right.
Again, it's much like Russian social media. They're not going to censor you for saying, well, you should have done even more than you did.
Right.
They censor people more for saying, oh, the regime is bad and we don't want them to do that. Like if you're someone who's like, no, the regime needs to do even more, be even tougher, be even more hardline.
Right.
That stuff tends to not get censored. Right. And so, there were people calling for like, just shoot her plane out of the sky.
I know
like,
how ridiculous of an idea is that. First of all, loss of human life. I don't care if you don't like Nancy Pelosi. That's just not okay, period. And second of all, this is like a very high-ranking U.S. official.
The third highest-ranking U.S. official.
Yeah, like this isn't the garbage man, right? Like that's an act of war. Yeah, and I think this is kind of part and parcel as you're bringing this up with the idea of this very strong rousing of the population that she is doing under this nationalist rhetoric. And I was wondering if you can talk maybe just a little bit more about how this nationalist discourse affects China's domestic and foreign policy decision making. As an example, send a balloon over to go torpedo the Blinken meeting.
Yeah. Well, in the article, I talk about how by the time the West sort of really gets into China, trying to open China up in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, China is very inward looking at this point. As I said, they've reached their point of greatest territorial extent. Mm-hmm. They were, by far the richest, most developed state on Earth. Around the time of, I can't remember the statistic, but it was something like in 1690, they accounted for like 50% of world GDP or something like that, whatever those numbers are worth.
Insane.
But it's just something crazy, like they had invented movable type, ages before the West, gunpowder, all that different stuff. When the West first showed up trying to trade with, the Chinese court, they were like, what are you even doing here? Like, we don't want any of that crap. Right. Like, what are you doing? So one of the only things that the British could really sell was opium. And of
Opium
course,
Wars. Mm-hmm.
the Opium Wars. So, and by that point, the Chinese state had started to atrophy and had not kept pace with certain technological and military developments that the West had already undergone because of the very intensive competitive environment of Europe. Mm-hmm. Europe, one book that I always recommend people read is either Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, because there's several great chapters on warfare and inter-European warfare in that book that talk about these things, and also Charles Tilley's Capital Coercion and European State Formation, which talks a lot about that pressure to fight wars and to concentrate resources and, adopt new developments and new technologies because it could help you win wars. Mm-hmm. China was just so big and so powerful that there was just no need for that, and they had been effectively able to sort of civilizationally and economically dominate their region. Well, the Century of Humiliation is something that from about 1848 to 1950, it's a huge thing. It's an absolutely huge thing. It's in all the textbooks. It's more than just a rhetorical device. I mean, people's grandparents lived through this. Mm-hmm. The tail ends of this. It was war, rebellion, more war, defeat. Millions and millions of people getting killed in these internal rebellions and civil wars, like a new warring states period, a warlord period, the Sino-Japanese wars, 2 of those, the Civil War. It was just horrifying. It was like the worst century. If you could pick a place not to be, China during that 100 years there, that was really one of the places where you would not have wanted to have been. Mm-hmm. It's tough. And so Mao, kind of his whole idea was he and the communists had made China strong, that they were the ones who were modernizing China, that they were the ones who had kicked out the, imperialist Western aggressors, and that is in some sense a legitimating device. And so that is used by the CCP leadership today. And, those who control the present control the past, right? The old Orwell quote. Right. There is a lot of truth to that, though. And especially to the stories that China tells about itself and how it was treated during that time. Now, if you want to say, well, that was part and parcel, that's just how states behave. The strong do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. That's fine. But, the Chinese have been around for a very, very long time. And to them, that was a momentary blip. Right. A drop in the bucket. That was a drop in the bucket. The West was strong, but now the West looks like it's in decline. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that you've seen a lot as I've gone back and started looking through journals and op-eds and pieces like that going back, starting in the late 2000s, after the great financial crisis, after the second Iraq War, after the Afghanistan War, you start to see a lot of this declinism, that America, the West, they're in decline, that China is reascendant, that was all that Century of Humiliation, that was just a blip. And so, how much of that is for propaganda purposes? Well, it's hard to say, but one of the parallels that strikes me as interesting is the first I don't know if they call it the first, second, which German empire do they call it? Well, anyway, it was the German Empire under the Kaiser. Mm-hmm. Who essentially created this national fervor, these expectations that ultimately it looked like were going to be disappointed, and which caused he and his general staff to engage in a series of brinksmanship-style gambles. And one of the things that strikes me is everyone always says they never expected the war they got when they got it. It's like, well,
what did you expect after doing what you did?
We expected a small local war, but we were willing to tolerate a medium-sized regional war, and what we got instead was a global conflagration. And it's like, well, that'll happen. Can we learn from these things? Mm-hmm. I don't know. People still talk about it like, well, we could fight a very limited engagement with the Chinese over Taiwan, and they war game it out, they plan it out. The Center for Strategic Studies just 2 months ago actually released some where they said they think that the U.S. and Japan and Taiwan would, quote unquote, win, that they could deny the Chinese a landing, but that it was going to cost most of the Pacific Fleet, most of the airplanes, tens of thousands of American lives. And it's like, whoa.
And how many trillions of dollars?
Hold on a second here. Like, this is our limited engagement here. Like, you actually think that if tens of thousands of Americans are getting killed, that Washington's just going to leave it at that? Like, that's not how I remember it going in the past. So I don't know.
How many thousand people died in 9/11, and how many millions have died in the wars that happened since? A study just came out recently, a couple weeks ago, that I've been reviewing, that we might do an episode on, that talks about like something like the death toll is like 4.5 million, and that's of what we can tell, right?
Yeah, which to me seemed low. Right. I mean, it was horrifying to read, but my initial impression was like, it just seems low. How do you even count the damage that those things have done?
Well, that's part of what the paper kind of discusses.
Yeah.
It's like, should we start including the ancillary deaths, right? So not just the direct deaths, the people who were in combat, the people who were blown up, or even the civilian casualties, collateral damage, but also, hey, we blew up a hospital and somebody got sick and therefore couldn't go to that hospital. So
exactly,
they died. Do they count or do they not count? And I think that whole study comes to a conclusion that like we might be able to ascribe almost every death in that region after 9/11 to 9/11,
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the rise in, for example, infant mortality and the decline in life expectancy,
that's right.
I mean, talking about, as an American, one of the things that stood out to me when the Russians, invaded Ukraine was, why aren't they blowing up all their infrastructure and all that stuff? Because I'm used to, that's how the Americans fight their wars.
Right.
It's like, well, first you just destroy anything that could sustain human life.
Right. All the bridges, all the power plants, everything else.
And then you roll in there. You know what I mean? So in a very messed up kind of way, it seemed more civilized, than how the Americans, rolled into Iraq, targeting, water supplies, electricity, But
yeah, well,
I don't know. It
seems like
that paper that study was interesting, and I didn't get a chance to make it all the way through to the methodological sections and really get down into the nitty gritty. But like, did they include Somalia?
Yeah,
Libya, and Yemen?
That is about where I started tuning out as well. So unclear. I can't speak to that. But it's just fascinating, and I'm still working through it. And like I said, I think that might make its way into a slot here on Bro History soon. But
that would definitely be interesting. And I told you before we started, I've just been so busy with the book and with other things. I've just got this pile of, save it.
Yeah,
so the rest of the summer is going to be very, very busy after we get the book done here. So
for sure. But I mean, I think it's fascinating as a, kind of coming back to China. It's like, okay, well, all these little steps that you take, like buzzing an aircraft carrier with a jet within 1,000 feet, what are they thinking, And then on our side, what are we thinking? Limited engagement in Taiwan. Yeah, this sounds like a good idea because we really need to box in China. We really need those microchips. Actually, we legitimately do need those microchips. So we need to solve that problem. I don't know, man. It's some fascinating stuff.
Okay, so the chips. Yeah, the chips. I think that's one of the things that gets raised a lot, and that I think is a perfectly valid point. Can say whatever you want about why it was that 90% of the world's microchips were being made on, this one island that was, technically part of China, and that, but, whatever. What's done is done.
Foregone conclusion. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I would just say, yes, they are trying to friendshore and reshore that capacity. That's going to take some time. In the meantime, I've said repeatedly, like, I don't see that China wants to, don't see that it's in mainland China's interest to invade Taiwan. I mean, the status quo has worked just fine. They're one another's biggest trading partners. Those fabs would never survive an invasion. I think I had said it last year when I was talking to you guys, like, the U.S. would blow those things up.
Right.
Before they let China,
yeah.
or Taiwan would do it themselves. And like now it's openly talked about, like, well, of course we would just bomb those things rather than let China get them. I think one of the things that's been going on in the background that's really alarming is the campaign by the United States to coordinate a strategy of denial for these microchips, to keep that advanced lithography equipment away from China and to keep China from getting those high grade chips, coordinating with the Dutch and the British and the Koreans and the Japanese. And you saw, maybe you didn't see this, but a couple weeks ago, China retaliated by placing sanctions on a U.S. company. And of course, Washington, issued a statement saying, like, this is just completely unacceptable. And it's like, well, guys, come on. Like,
they were playing a game here now.
Right? Like, this is not cool. This is not cool at all. So, I don't know.
What's fascinating on that chip bit, I was reading an article before jumping on today talking about how Taiwanese companies are going so far as to not let, like, Chinese students work in their chip fabs because they don't want them to steal chip technology. So it's like getting down to like research students too, like, forget brain drain. Like, we don't even want you because you're Chinese.
There's been an aggressive campaign in the United States going on for years to purge Chinese academics, and it actually, this has been going on for a while, but there was a letter that was put forth a few months ago by this collection of research colleges and stuff that were saying, like, look, dear federal government, you've really got to stop doing this. Like, we understand why you wanted to do this, but it's led to a lot of just basic profiling, and it's led to a real drop off in qualified, professors and students wanting to come and work here. And I think it's very telling when you look statistically at STEM performance and whose students are excelling and where and why. The United States is just not producing top caliber STEM students comparatively. So, it's incredible to see the decline across the board there. But we really can't get into all our own problems, or we'll be here for the rest of the evening. But just kind of bring it around, I guess, just the idea that China has legitimate interests, that they are national interests, that they are easy to discern, that you can look at how they've behaved in the past, that they kind of view that area as a long-term, like, sinosphere. And this was recognized even by the most statist of American thinkers, like Samuel Huntington. Right. Samuel Huntington, author of the Trilateral Commission Report, in Clash of Civilizations in the 1990s. He wrote, I don't have it in front of me, but I think I cite it in the article or in the book chapter. I don't remember which. But
I think I have that in front of me. Let me see if I
cite it in the article? Okay.
Yeah, I think you did. I had some quotes. As Samuel Huntington observed in 1996, a reconstituted and powerful China interested in resurrecting its classical sphere of influence was already a cultural and economic reality in the process of becoming a political one. You want to explain that process of becoming a political reality?
Yes. Doing the institution building. Building, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, building alternative institutions that China controlled and which could be used to exert political, I'm going to say control. I don't want that to sound like pejorative, but, like, it's just a fact, right? It's just a fact that that's how these institutions work. Like the IMF, who has the power in the IMF? The United States has the power in the IMF,
Correct.
right? Like we don't say it like that, but like it's understood.
Right.
It's understood who really makes the rules there, who controls the power. And so, you know, you have to have institutions for constructively wielding your influence. And that's what China needed to build at that point. And that's what, for example, the Belt and Road is a good example of kind of the sort of political institutional structure and relationship that you need to exert that kind of influence.
And even the digital Silk Road, that's relatively new, which is kind of along the same lines, but just online, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to tell for me where to go, because on the one hand, you know, you want to be able to have the kinds of dialogue, you know, that you point out that FDR did with Stalin and that Nixon did with Mao. You want to be able to have this kind of dialogue, but on the other hand, it doesn't seem like anyone's acting in good faith, right? On both sides, frankly. So you did conclude your article talking about that, you know, American leaders should be able to negotiate with people like Xi, right? Or even Putin, you pointed out, right? Which I'm all open to talking, but, you know, it's easier said than done, I feel like, right?
At this point, I feel like so many things have been done that I would not have done, that were just not necessary. Like, it never had to be this way. Like, were the Russians going to meddle in the politics of the countries directly adjoining them? Yes. Is that, you know, a violation of core American interests? Is that a reason to blow up our relationship with Russia? To endanger the European Union? You know, like, no, not in my opinion. You know, same with China. Like, Taiwan has been an outstanding issue for many, many decades now. Does it need resolving? There's no pressure that I can see. I mean, even the idea that there's pressure from the Taiwanese to have it resolved, like, that is largely, you know, a figment of the Western press. Like, there is a whole nother,
right?
There's a whole nother political party in Taiwan that doesn't want anything to do with independence.
Right.
And they just cleaned house in the local elections last year, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not they take the presidency in this coming election in 2024, I believe it is. So, you know, the cynic in me thinks, you know, is Washington trying to provoke a conflict now because they think that the clock is running against them, that China will only be more powerful in the future, and that maybe if they can provoke Xi into doing it now and he loses, it will destroy the regime? To me, we've talked about this in other episodes. Like, I feel like the clock is running completely the opposite way.
Right.
I think time favors. Yeah, exactly. I think time only favors, you know, the West and Taiwan's independence, frankly. Just let China sink and flounder under all the problems that it has. You know, I don't wish ill on, you know, them, because obviously state collapse, nothing good happens when your state collapses. So,
right. And it's
you know,
not
I
just
have a lot of libertarian friends who are like, yeah, let's have the state collapse. It's like, well, careful what you wish for.
Right.
Like, I can't find any examples in history where it goes well at all. So,
and it's not just like limited to them either, right? China's so deeply entwined in the global economy that they rely
it'd be bad
on
for
us,
everybody,
and we rely on them, you know, for a lot.
Oh yeah,
you know,
Walmart would be very empty tomorrow.
Walmart.
Yeah, Walmart would be very, very empty.
Wish.com would just immediately evaporate, you know.
So.
Yeah, man. I mean,
but there are huge costs to this increased, you know, the relationship between the U.S. and China getting bad has costs that aren't even really seen and calculated. Like the idea of people, of corporations, you know, investing in setting up like backup supply lines and stuff like that's all, you know, redundant. That's all redundancy. You know, like relocating or doubling their operations in other places, like that's all just economic redundancy. Like That's all cost that could be used in, research and development of other things,
Right.
put into more human resources, different things. Like, there are a lot of costs to this stuff.
And all we got to do is just not be aggressive with one another.
Yes. I mean, it's like you said, it's not all one-sided. And certainly the Chinese have become much more assertive in the South China Sea. So it's not like they're going to stop. I feel like they've built up a narrative of, Chinese power, Chinese century on the march, that I feel like there is an expectation at this point that they are going to deliver, that they're not going to be cowed by the United States. And this is not something new. Mao, of course, was famous for freaking out the Soviets because he said openly that, like, let them have a nuclear war with us. We don't care if the Americans start trying to nuclear bomb us. We'll just retreat into the hills. There's a billion of us. You can't nuke us all.
Right.
We'll be fine.
That's nuts.
So, yeah. So there is a tradition of that. So I don't think that China is, and that was when they were poor and had no navy and no nukes and no missiles or anything.
Well, actually, I think that kind of was to their credit to be poor, right? Because they got nothing to lose, right?
That's true. They do have something to lose now.
Right.
But will they lose it if they are seen to not be pursuing China's interests to the fullest extent that they can? So this is not a good. Yeah, it's not a good situation that we're in here. So, but
not to freak you out about it either, right? Go about your lives,
right.
and
yeah,
don't
just
worry
try to live your lives. Encourage moderation, encourage compromise, encourage patience,
dialogue.
Obviously, if you're reading the press right now, you'll know that Beijing have basically said no to repeated U.S. efforts to get on the phone, to get face-to-face, to talk. This is kind of reminiscent to what's happened to a few administrations. Going back to George W. Bush, going back to Clinton, there were, we're going to get real tough with China. And we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then eventually, and China would basically just ignore the phone and be like, look, until you do this, this, and this, we're not going to pick up the phone. And eventually the United States would come around to being like, well, we do kind of need them to do this and this for us. And, we need their cooperation on this and that. We'll see whether or not they're able to reestablish contact, but it's certainly scary to know that they're not talking. Especially as you pointed out, there've been a lot of close calls. There was that surveillance plane the other day. That's the one that really freaks me out, because there's been plenty of instances like that have happened. So
I mean, all it takes is just one mistake, right?
Yeah. And with relations being so bad and with them not talking, there's just no basis for something constructive to happen in a situation like that now. So, but everyone live your lives, be cool, be calm, but also encourage your respective governments to be cool. So that's basically my only recommendation.
Just chill out.
Don't encourage the hawks. Doesn't need to come to a fight.
Right.
Doesn't need to. Hasn't come to a fight.
We can just keep doing what we've been doing, and
it can just keep going, and we'll just see whose system can outlast whose.
Right.
So
let's run the marathon, not the 500-meter dash, right?
Exactly. So.
Well, I don't remember if we were talking about this before we started the show or after, but I'm struggling to paraphrase you, Joe. You were thinking about writing or doing some research on how we need equality before everything else, and that how we don't play, and by we I mean the United States, don't play by a global set of rules, right? Like nobody can enforce our rules, the international laws and things like that on the United States, because we're just going to ignore it. So kind of bringing this full circle, that seems to me to be one of the gripes that countries like China have, that countries like Russia have, kind of bringing us back to a multipolar world rather than the unipolar one that we've been experiencing for at least the last 30 years or so. So My proposition is that we take all this money that we're spending on these limited engagements that we're proposing, right, that kill tens of thousands of people, and we dump it into these UAP programs. Here's why. Here's why. Because when we find the aliens that have the capability of traveling across the vast distances of space, now suddenly we have an authority to regulate a bit. So I will come full circle on aliens. I think we need aliens to resolve this issue.
That has been historically what has produced the cohesive movements, towards national cohesion and state building. That's certainly true. So maybe we need an alien invasion to get us all on the same page.
Right. Or even, I think, just honestly, let's pretend for a moment that the CIA or the global dark governments around the world know that aliens exist. If it got out globally that indeed they do exist, I think we wouldn't even need the invasion. Just the existence, the mere existence, and the knowledge of the existence of extraterrestrial beings is going to shake things up quite a bit. I don't even think we need the invasion.
Yeah, I would certainly prefer it to happen without the invasion, because if they can travel through interstellar space, they're going to liquefy us in a heartbeat.
Yeah, we wouldn't stand a chance.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you. Put up a really interesting fight, though, I tell you that. Can you imagine those space battles that we'd be waging with the technology that we probably said that we didn't have?
So that's where all the money was going.
Right. I'm reminded of a film. I wonder if you've ever seen it, Iron Sky. Have you seen this film? It's kind of an indie cult classic kind of film. And the premise of the film is that the Nazis during World War II actually had a fairly advanced space program, and were able to, much like how many Nazis escaped to places like South America, Argentina, places like that, that actually a group of them went to the dark side of the moon. Right, and it's set in like a recent time period where we've got a Sarah Palin type character running for president, and suddenly the moon Nazis reveal themselves, right, and they come over here, and now the whole world has to fight against the moon Nazis who somehow have been able to manage to live on the moon all this time. So yeah, moon Nazis.
Sarah Palin versus the moon Nazis.
Yeah.
Someone please make that movie.
They've made it. It's called Iron Sky. Go watch it.
Iron Sky. Yeah. Watch it, people.
It's a funny one. It's absolutely hilarious. All right, man. So, I've held you up for, I think, longer than I should have. Thank you again for coming on the show and for, being a good fill-in for myself last time around, and also for Henry this time around. We really appreciate you. I want to give you a few minutes here to just go ahead and plug all the stuff for you so people know where to find you and your work, but go for it.
Sure. So I'm at the Libertarian Institute now. I write a weekly column there. It's mostly focused on China. They do let me do the occasional piece on things like
aliens.
I do. I haven't asked them, but I'm sure they would let me if I could put something together that was good. No, I do a lot of writing about like late 19th century, early 20th century U.S. politics and foreign policy. I think those are some of the least understood, least appreciated. These were highly transformative and intertwined. But anyway, you can check them out on the Libertarian Institute. I've put out a few of them already. One of them about the Spanish-American War, but there's another piece that I'm working on right now about just a variety of interlocking crises that happened and that were dealt with around that time during like the Cleveland and McKinley and then first Roosevelt administration. I'm working on a book that's going to be coming out. I've been working on the final draft of it, the final edits, which I'm supposed to have to Keith tomorrow. The fake China threat and its very real danger. So that'll be coming out this year. And then, as you were saying, I'm working on this piece for this journal called Isonomia, and isonomia is the Greek concept of equality before the law.
That's the word
and
I was
one of
looking
the
for.
problems. Yeah, and one of the problems, of course, is that that liberalism works within states because there is an authority to enforce contracts and wield the stick. And of course, the great problem of international relations is that you can't have global liberalism because you don't have a global rights enforcing mechanism. The United States refuses to acknowledge the, legitimacy of, courts, which it, shames others, for example, for not listening to.
Right.
So it's a problem.
Do as we say, not as we do.
Yes, precisely. So, and that, as you said, that is a problem because, it could have been different at the end of the Cold War, the New World Order, had the United States been willing to be bound to follow its own rules, maybe things would have been a little different, but certainly several conflicts in the 90s and then, the George W. Bush. I often wonder, did the Florida Supreme Court ruin the world? Like, would Al Gore really have destroyed the empire this way? Like, George W. Bush was such a raging idiot.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone surrounding him was just just the biggest bunch of highly qualified idiots.
Right.
I mean, it's just unbelievable. Like, these were the people who his dad literally would not let anywhere near serious parts of policy. Like, they were supposed to just run death squads in Central America. That was all they were allowed to do.
Right.
And they just had the run of the roost under George W. Bush, and they just destroyed everything. And so now here we are. So, not saying the empire would have been perfect, far from it.
How about the alternate reality?
Anyway.
Alternate reality where it still happened under Al Gore, and George Bush became like a climate activist. That would be interesting.
The Inconvenient Truth.
Right.
By
George W. Bush.
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, that's kind of what I'm working on, and so yeah, you can look for that stuff. Follow me on Twitter at Solis_Mullen. That's where I post everything, and so yeah, happy to fill in for you guys. Really happy for Henry, obviously. It was great talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. If you've listened this far into the show, the best way to support the show is, of course, to go ahead and subscribe and rate and review our show. It's the best way to help us move forward. We also have a brand new website that you can go and check out. We've got blog posts and all of our content on there as well. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you again next time. Peace.